Jai Shri Ram. Whenever battles from our stories are discussed, one trait often brought up is the following of strict rules of engagement on both sides. Whether in the Mahabharata or anywhere else, we are told of how fighting began after the sunrise and ended by sunset, that the two sides stopped in order to eat food which was served together, that a warrior who was not already engaged with an opponent could not be engaged simultaneously by another, unarmed people could not be attacked, and so on and so on. There are even more rules than that, but I have listed off kind of the most commonly spoken of ones. When we look at the rest of world history, however, we find that the following of such rules by other societies are few and far between. And when they are present, they're in very, very recent times. And so, because of the lasting negative effect of Islamic invasions, which are still felt to this day in the Indian subcontinent, many Hindus like to sit on a moral high horse and claim that, well, we were so civilized and cultured, and the invaders were not. They were just barbarians, and that's why we were conquered. I wouldn't have anything positive to say about the invaders on one hand, about what they did or their ideology. But what I do want to point out is that there is no glory in getting defeated and overrun simply because you were more ethical and humanitarian than the other side. Those considerations can only be ethical and humanitarian if the other side holds to them as well. If the other side does not hold to them, but rather flouts them with reckless abandon or simply does not recognize them at all as being legitimate, as in the case of the Islamic invasions, then holding to these rules of engagement is foolish to the point of being suicidal. Whenever we think about our itihasas that tell us about how these rules of engagement were followed, two things need to be made abundantly clear. First, Hindu kings never fought other Hindu kings on the basis of ideology. They did not have any desire to uproot or replace the existing beliefs and practices of their fellow Hindus whom they were trying to conquer. They did not want to supplant their value system either. And they were not, and they even held the same value system, as their opponents. Their squabbles and disagreements were purely political, being based on geopolitical strategy as well as the natural hunger for more wealth, fame, and of course power that tends to characterize politics and conquests throughout history. This is a key difference between Hindu versus Hindu wars and Hindu versus Muslim wars, where the Muslim side wished to either convert the Hindus to Islam, force them to live under subjugation as third-class citizens in their own land as dhimmis, or a combination of these two. The other point that I wanted to bring up was the fact that many of the Hindu kings, when interacting with one another, had decent to very good relations with one another. There are many stories of swayamvars, which we've all heard of, where a princess would be given the choice of numerous royal suitors being princes and will put a mala on the one that she wishes to marry. Now, if you think about this logically for 2 seconds, of course, if you are hosting these kinds of events and giving all this food and entertainment and lodging for all of these kings and noble entourages and so on, and are even willing to get your daughter married to possibly any one of their sons, then that indicates that even in the past or in the future, if you have had wars or battles against them, you didn't really despise them or want to see them humiliated or subjugated, because that wasn't the nature of the kinds of fights that you were having with them. Much less would you have wanted to see them destroyed. Which leads to my further point that these kings had enough of a common cultural value system and had enough respect for one another that they could have realistically been counted on by all others to make sure that these rules of engagement were obeyed. This again brings up the difference between these conflicts and the conflicts that Hindu kings would later have against Muslims. As we know, Islam views non-Muslims as being absolutely inferior to Muslims and views Hindus as the lowest of the low because in their eyes we are polytheistic pagan idol worshippers guilty of shirk, the highest sin in Islam, associating partners with Allah, as they would say. So when dealing with people of such a mindset, the Hindus should have the idea that Hindus should understand that Muslims maintained their military rules of engagement with us, which were obviously completely different from our own, because first off, they didn't include many of the things that I listed at the beginning of this video, and secondly, they discriminated against people based on their religious beliefs, if they were Muslims or if they were other Abrahamists, so-called people of the book being Christians or Jews, or if they were, in their view, pagan. So when fighting the Muslim kings, when Hindus are fighting the Muslim kings, following these kinds of rules of engagement that we have from our own society is totally impractical. And to whatever degree it was done, it has contributed to many of the problems that Hindu society faces today coming from the Muslims, whether that's conversion, the destruction of temples, demographic issues, so on and so forth. And the reason that this is so important to note is many Hindus have this kind of overly humanistic or overly kind of compassionate kind of idea that, well, you know, civilians are civilians and, you know, women are women and, you know, no matter what an invading military force does, their families and communities and so on, they're exempt from that. What people are really missing the entire point as being is that in Islam, these things are viewed as basically civilizational wars of what is truly righteous and good in the world, which of course Muslims would see Islam being, and all of these forces of darkness and ignorance and evil and paganism, which they would see the rest of the non-Muslim world, specifically the Hindus, as being. And so the reason that I'm talking about this is to make it very clear that any kind of humanitarian views or ethical views you have towards treating people from another civilization or another society a certain way, they have to be first built upon some kind of practical consideration. And just because people from our society, when interacting, you know, violently in wars with people who are also from our same society but ruled by a different king, just because we had certain rules of engagement in those kinds of conflicts, that doesn't have anything at all to do with how we should be or how we should have been interacting with the Muslims or the colonizers or anyone else. So that's all I've got for you guys today. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Jai Shri Ram.